uh, start this keynote speech session. Um, I'm one of the founding members and third president of this association. It has been several years since the last time I participated in the uh, annual Congress of AAERE. So I'm very moved, deeply moved, and happy to be here, and very much honored to have an opportunity to introduce to all of you two honorable speakers in this session. As you may know, as you may have already noticed, this session consists of two keynote speeches. Each of them will be followed by short Q&A sessions. The first speaker is the Professor Robert Pindyck of MIT, as you know. Before we listen to his talk, I would like to introduce him by reading his personal profile briefly. Professor Pindyck is the banker of Tokyo Mitsubishi Professor of Economics and Finance in the Sloan School of Management at MIT. He is also research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. He is a fellow of Econometric Society, a past president and fellow of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, and the winner of Leamison Prize for Excellence in Teaching. Professor Pindyck's research and writing have covered topics in microeconomics and industrial organization, and the behavior of natural resource and commodity markets, financial markets, capital investment decisions, and environmental economics. His recent work in environmental economics has focused on climate change and examined policy design in the face of uncertainty. He has also worked on economic and policy implications of global catastrophic events, including the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Pindyck has published numerous academic journal articles, and he's also the author of and the co-author of 7 books. He has been co-editor of the Review of Economics and Statistics. In addition to his academic research and teaching, Professor Pindyck has been a consultant to a large number of public and private organizations. Now it is time to listen to Professor Pindyck's speech. He is going to give a talk titled Climate Change, What We Know and Don't Know, What to Expect and What to Do. Okay, Professor Pindyck, are you ready? I hope you would complete your presentation within about 30 to 35 minutes because of a tight schedule. And you may add your speech during Q&A sessions.
Let me give you a quick overview of what I want to do. So I want to tell you first a little bit about the kinds of things we know and the kinds of things we don't know about climate change, and why it is that we don't really know what the social cost of carbon is, why it's so hard to estimate that. I want to tell you that what really matters for policy is the chance of a catastrophic climate outcome. That's really all that matters. And how likely is that? How large an impact? Well, that's the big problem that we have to talk about. I'll say a little bit about what to do and what to expect. I'm going to tell you that it is extremely unlikely that we will be able to prevent a temperature increase greater than 2 degrees Celsius, never mind 1.5 degrees. And we have to prepare for that, and that means mostly it means investing in adaptation. And then I want to stress that once we are in the world of catastrophes, and we're talking about a climate catastrophe, other catastrophes are possible: pandemics, nuclear terrorism, bioterrorism. We can go on and on. And these are not independent. And we have to think about the implications. And that brings us to the question, after all, this is an audience of economists: how do we value life? How do we think about the value of lost lives as a result of some of these catastrophic events? All right, that's the plan. Let me show you some basic things you know. Here's temperature. This is the global mean temperature from 1880 to about a year ago. You can see that not much happened. It actually went down a little bit between 1880 and 1910. But since about 1950, let's say, the temperature has been increasing and accelerating from 1980 onwards. We already have had about a 1 degree Celsius increase already. So we're already up by 1 degree Celsius. And what's the cause of this? Well, here's the CO2 concentration. And you can see the CO2 concentration. It had been around 315 parts per million prior to 1960. It is now at around 415 parts per million. So it has risen dramatically, and that's the main cause of the increase in temperature. Now, let me show you a diagram that has some good news and some bad news. Let me begin with the good news. The good news is at the bottom of this diagram, the red area, the United States, the blue area, especially the blue area, Europe. And what you see here is that emissions, this is CO2 emissions, annual CO2 emissions, increased steadily up until about 1990. And then they started declining somewhat, not a lot, but somewhat, especially in Europe. Less so in the United States, but a little bit in the United States. Furthermore, if you look at current policy in Europe and the United States, it is likely that emissions will decline more. Now, are they going to decline to net zero by 2050? Unlikely, but they will decline. That's the good news. What's the bad news? Everything else on this diagram, everything else. Look at China. Look how rapidly its emissions have been increasing. Look at Asia, that's you, Korea, and the rest of Asia, especially countries in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Bangladesh. Their emissions, this is not India, but other Asian countries, their emissions, again, sharply increasing. India, sharply increasing emissions. Basically, if you exclude Europe and the United States, which together only account for about 30% of world CO2 emissions, we're looking at major increases in emissions, at least over the coming decade, probably farther out. And what does that mean? It means that even if Europe and the United States could reduce their emissions to zero, which won't happen, but even if it could, you have 70% of world emissions today that are still growing rapidly. So that's the bad news. Now, let me go over some things that we know and don't know. What do we know? We know that what drives CO2 emissions is economic activity. If we shut down the economy, the world economy, stop producing, stop consuming, there'll be no emissions. But of course, what matters is how much CO2 gets emitted per dollar of GDP. I'm using dollars. You can use any currency you want. And that's called carbon intensity, CO2 per dollar of GDP. And you can break it down into a product of two things: energy intensity, which is BTUs per $1 billion of GDP. In other words, how much energy do we consume for every dollar of GDP, times what I call energy efficiency. Sometimes it's called carbon efficiency, which is how much CO2 comes out for every BTU of energy that's used. All right. Carbon intensity is the product of those two things. If you multiply BTUs per dollar by CO2 per BTU, the BTUs cancel out and you get CO2, here it's in megatons per dollar per $1 billion. That's carbon intensity. Why do we break it up like this? Because it's the forces that affect energy intensity and energy efficiency are quite different. So to understand and predict carbon intensity, we need to look at these components. What's happened? First of all, energy intensity. It's declined in the United States and in Europe because we simply use much less energy than we did before for every dollar of GDP. It's also declined in China. But be careful here. The reason it declined in China is that GDP was so incredibly low in China back in 1980, 85, 1990. So because GDP grew so rapidly, even though energy use also grew rapidly in China, energy per dollar or per renminbi of GDP or per yuan of GDP actually declined in China. But now, as China's economy has become large, that's no longer the case. If you look at India, if you look at Southeast Asia, not the case. Energy intensity has been increasing. Energy efficiency has improved in Europe and the US. No change in China, no change in India. It's gotten worse in Southeast Asia. Overall, not much happening. Carbon intensity as a whole for the world, it was about 0.69 megatons of CO2 per $1 billion in 1980. It decreased to about 0.50 in 2018. That's about a 30% decline. Wonderful. That suggests that we would have a decline in CO2 emissions. The problem is world GDP tripled over this period, so CO2 emissions increased. Here you see it graphically. The blue line is China, and you can see that its carbon intensity decreased from 1980 to 2000 because its economy grew so incredibly fast. Then carbon intensity leveled out. The black line, it's a little hard to see, it's down here. The black line is the world, and it declined for the world by about 30%. If there had been no GDP growth in the world, CO2 emissions would have declined by 30%. But as I said, world GDP tripled. How do you reduce CO2 emissions? There are two ways to do it, only two ways: reduce GDP or reduce carbon intensity. You can reduce carbon intensity via energy intensity, use less energy, or energy efficiency. Whatever energy you use, make it green energy. All right, that's the only way to reduce emissions. Reduce GDP, or reduce carbon intensity. And what's going to happen in the future? Very hard to say. Very hard to predict. First of all, it's very hard to predict GDP, but it's very hard to predict what will happen to carbon intensity. Now, let's suppose we did know what will happen, and we did know what will happen to CO2 emissions over the next 50, 80 years. Suppose. What's going to happen to the temperature? We don't know. It depends on a number called climate sensitivity, the increase in temperature that eventually, when everything gets into equilibrium, results from a doubling of the atmospheric CO2 concentration. And the most likely range, according to the IPCC, is about 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. That's a very wide range. And it means that there's a lot of uncertainty over climate sensitivity. And here you see the problem. These are probability densities from 5 different studies. Each study came up with its own probability distribution for climate sensitivity. The one on the left, the orange line, very optimistic. It has climate sensitivity somewhere between 1 degree and 3 degrees. That's not bad. The others are less optimistic and very wide range. 1.5 to maybe 5, 6 degrees. Very large range. I looked at 131 studies, and this is a histogram of what those studies call their best estimates of climate sensitivity. Many, many people are working on this. There have been so many studies. These are the best estimates. In red, it's before 2010, blue since 2010. And look at this, they're all over the place, a wide, wide range. And these are the best estimates. If you look at the high and the low, the minimum estimates and the maximum estimates of these studies, again, very large range. What does this tell us? We really don't know what climate sensitivity is. Even if we knew what would happen to CO2 emissions and the CO2 concentration, we would not know what that would do to temperature. And why is that? The reason is that there are these feedback loops. And think about it this way, let S sub 0 be climate sensitivity with no feedback. Take all the feedback loops and wrap them into one number, F, which is less than 1. Because it's close to 1, any uncertainty over the feedback factor gets magnified into uncertainty over climate sensitivity. So it's these feedback loops and the fact that we don't know their actual values that creates all of this uncertainty over climate sensitivity. Now, climate sensitivity, at least we can talk coherently. We can talk about studies that have been done. We can argue about which studies we think are better than other studies. All right, there's some science that we can talk about. But what about the impact of climate change? Suppose we can actually predict climate change through 2100. Suppose we could predict the increase in temperature, the rise in sea levels, and so on. What would that do? What would be the impact? I mean, that's what matters. If there's no impact, then we don't care about climate change. What matters is the impact. And so how big would that impact be? What would it do to GDP broadly defined? Let me include health effects, morbidity, mortality, and so on in GDP. We'll monetize those things. Well, that's what matters. What would it do to a broadly defined measure, GDP? And the answer is we don't know. We don't have a clue. Why not? Because we have no theory, no economic theory, no physical theory, no any theory, and we have no data. We've never experienced a 2 degree or 4 degree or 6 degrees Celsius increase in global mean temperature. We have no experience. You can say, well, wait a minute, haven't we had some very hot summers where the temperature was 2 or 3 degrees higher than normal? Sure, but that's not a change in climate. That's a change in weather. And climate and weather are two very different things. So we have not had experience with climate change. It occurs slowly. It allows for adaptation. And that's what creates uncertainty. I'm going to skip over these. I was going to give you some examples of adaptation, but I'm going to skip over these. You can look at the slides. Here's just one nice picture. This is a plan to build a seawall around lower Manhattan. Right now, it's a plan. They've spent $100 million to kind of work out the engineering, but whether it'll get built is unclear. But that's an example of adaptation. You're worried about increasing sea levels. You're worried that it would flood Manhattan. This is a way to prevent that. There are many examples of adaptation. Hybrid grains, more efficient drip irrigation, flood-resistant construction technologies, new seawalls, and so on. And geoengineering, putting sulfur in the atmosphere. We may have to go to that. Regulatory change. Right now, we subsidize, in the United States and Europe, we subsidize the construction of homes in very vulnerable areas. Why do we do that? Well, because builders and developers have political power. That's why. Remove those subsidies and discourage that kind of building. Look, adaptation is not going to eliminate the problem, but it will reduce the impact, and it creates uncertainty. All right, we don't know the impact, but don't these integrated assessment models that are used to estimate the social cost of carbon, I mean, they have an impact. They have a damage function, a loss function. Don't they tell us what's going to happen if temperature goes up? This is what the loss function looks like, L of T. And in the DICE model, the Nordhaus-Dice model, it has used an inverse quadratic loss function. So the loss, if T is the increase in temperature, if T is 0, there's no loss. T goes up, the loss goes up. Now, this is an arbitrary function. It's made up out of thin air. It's not based on any theory nor any data. The parameters are chosen so that the loss for 2 degrees or 3 degrees is consistent with common wisdom, whatever that means. You know, it's whatever people seem to think. There's no data, there's no theory. So I've written a lot about this. I've made a lot of enemies, unfortunately, because building these models is a big industry. And why do I talk about it? Because I feel that these models create a perception of knowledge and scientific precision that really is misleading and illusory. So I have issues with the use of these models. They're wonderful as descriptions, understand what's going on, but not for estimating a social cost of carbon, because we just don't know what the loss function is. We also don't know the discount rate. That's a big issue. We need a discount rate to get a social cost of carbon. And if we use a market discount rate, we're going to get a tiny number for the social cost of carbon. You know, the Ramsey formula with no uncertainty says that the discount rate is equal to delta, the rate of time preference, plus the growth rate of real growth rate of consumption, times the coefficient of risk aversion. If you use financial data, we know what G is. It's about 2%. If you use financial and macroeconomic data to get delta and eta, well, those numbers, eta, the coefficient of risk aversion, is between 2 and 5. Delta, the rate of pure time preference, 2% to 5%. Even if you use the low end, you're going to get a 6% discount rate, and that makes the social cost of carbon tiny. By the way, this is a deterministic Ramsey formula. If you introduce risk, you introduce random fluctuations and possible catastrophic decreases in GDP, the discount rate goes down. That'll get you a lower rate. But still, if you're using market-based numbers, you're going to have a very high discount rate. And that's a problem. Many people have argued for a low rate on ethical grounds, but whose ethics? I mean, how do you figure that out? How do you make these ethical arguments? All right. Look, if the discount rate is above 2%, all that matters is a catastrophic outcome. What is a catastrophic outcome? An extreme economic impact. Maybe a 20% or 40% drop in GDP. That'll give you, if the probability is high enough, a higher social cost of carbon. Whoops. But how likely and how extreme are the possible outcomes? The models, the integrated assessment models, can tell us absolutely nothing about this. What do we do? I've come to the conclusion that the best we can do at this point is use rough subjective estimates. This is analogous to the studies that were done assessing the risk of nuclear war back during the Cold War. There was no data. Fortunately, there was no data. There were no reliable models. And so the analyses were based on plausible estimates. And we can do the same thing when it comes to these catastrophic outcomes in climate. And we can also use expert elicitation, which I've done. I've surveyed economists and climate scientists to get a value for an average social cost of carbon. It's in a paper that was published in GEM, the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management, in 2019. Here's a summary of some of the estimates I got. These are individual estimates of the social cost of carbon among a very large number of experts, people who work in climate science, in climate economics, and who have had large numbers of highly cited publications. And what do you see here? What you see is that first, it's consistent with the social cost of carbon above $200. The number that's being used in the United States for policy purposes is $40 to $50. The number that's being used in Europe for policy analyses, around $50 or 40 euros. And it looks like, there's an argument here for a much higher number. Secondly, there's a huge amount of dispersion, a huge amount of uncertainty. Well, what do we do about that uncertainty? Do we just do nothing? Do we wait for more information? No, it's the opposite. The uncertainty itself creates an incentive for early action because it implies that there's insurance value. You worry about the extreme outcomes and you insure against them by reducing emissions today. All right. Let me go over what I think we can expect in terms of climate change and then a little bit about what we can do. First, the CO2 concentration has been increasing. It will continue to increase at least for the next 20 years. Whatever the US and Europe do, it's nice, but it's unrealistic to expect reductions, substantial reductions in emissions from China, India, Russia, Brazil, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, and so on. It's just not going to happen. Do you, sitting there, the audience, do you really believe that net zero global, not one country, global emissions will happen by 2050? If you do, you're optimist. That's wonderful. I don't. The global mean temperature is likely. Now I say likely. There's uncertainty here. We may be lucky, but we shouldn't count on it. Likely to rise more than 2 degrees Celsius, probably 3 degrees, at least 3 degrees. The other effects of climate are hard to predict, climate change. They depend on the temperature increase, which we can't predict. And even if we could, there's a huge uncertainty over the impact on sea levels, for example, or rainfall. So a lot of uncertainty. What'll be the impact? We don't know. Even if the temperature rises by 3 degrees Celsius, the impact might be limited, in part because of adaptation, but we can't count on that. So we're in a world where we face a great deal of uncertainty. What should we do? We should do everything we can to reduce global CO2 emissions, as well as methane, but CO2 is the real issue. And notice I've italicized the word global. Global. It has to be global. Reductions by the US and Europe will not do the trick. It has to be an international agreement that can be enforced. That's not easy. And we have to do this as efficiently as possible. And fortunately, my audience here is economists, so you're going to accept this. The most efficient way to do it is a carbon tax or cap and trade, but a carbon tax. Now, right now, that may be politically infeasible. We may have to use subsidies and mandates. That's too bad. It's very inefficient. Do what we can do. And we have to expand, not contract, expand the use of nuclear power if we want to have a completely decarbonized electricity sector. We can try to remove carbon from the atmosphere. We can plant trees. But, if you work out the arithmetic, you look at how many trees could conceivably be planted and how much CO2 each tree will absorb, it's pretty hard to see how you're going to reduce emissions by more than 2 or 3 gigatons per year. Global emissions right now are about 38 gigatons. So maybe you could reduce emissions by 10%. Even that would be difficult. What about carbon removal and sequestration? Right now, it's not even close to being economical, but we should do R&D and hopefully we'll develop more economical technologies for this. And we have to invest in adaptation. And that means heat-resistant crops, construction of seawalls, and yes, many environmentalists hate this, but we have to look into solar geoengineering if we end up with a real crisis. Now, complication, I think I have a few more minutes, 3 or 4. I said we have to focus on possible catastrophic outcomes, but we have to look beyond climate. Climate's in the news, but there are other things that could happen. COVID's in the news too. But 3 years before COVID, the CDC published studies showing that a pandemic as bad or worse than the Spanish flu of 1918-19 was going to happen. It was a question of when. It was going to happen. And it could be worse than the Spanish flu because people fly around in airplanes. So we got COVID. Right now, we're dealing with the Delta variant. We don't know what will happen later. Will there be an Epsilon variant, a Theta variant, a Zeta variant? What other variants are going to come? So there's a lot of uncertainty, and this is a possible catastrophe. Nuclear terrorism, bioterrorism, cyber terrorism can be catastrophic. Extreme earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. Look, we can go on and on, but we have to think about these things. And as I've shown in work with Ian Martin in our American Economic Review study, you can't look at these individually. They're interrelated. So we have to look at all of these possible catastrophes. And that means we also have to think about valuing life. Don't we know how to do that already? I mean, environmental economists, they use the VSL, the value of a statistical life. Haven't we solved the problem? This is the VSL. It's the marginal rate of substitution between wealth and the probability of survival. Here, P is the probability of dying from some event. Well, the problem is that the VSL tells us what people would pay versus what society will pay. It's increasing in wealth. Wealth goes up, VSL goes up. So it says the lives of the wealthy are more valuable than the lives of the poor. It doesn't aggregate. Take the United States. The current estimate used by the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Transportation, all regulatory agencies in the US, it's about $11 million per life saved. Well, 11 million times the number of people in the US, 330 million, gives you a number that's about 170 times US GDP. Well, how do you pay for that? You can't. And finally, the VSL measures the value of a small reduction in risk, not the value of life itself. What do we use? What should we use? We don't really have a handle on this. We don't know. There's no simple answer. This is something for all of you to work on. This is an area, a really interesting area of research. And related to this is the question of how do we think about changes in population? We look at increases in population, and some people say that's good because it leads to technological change. There's been more technological change as the population grew. We need people because we need young-old transfers. We need young people to take care of old people. And there are other people who say that population growth is bad. Crowding and congestion, environmental and resource use, the fragility of welfare systems. What's the net effect? Good, bad? There's no agreement. What about decreases in population? Based on behavior, what countries do, it seems that we view this as bad. We try to save lives. We try to prevent loss of life. If you put all this together, how do you value increases or decreases in population? This is relevant to climate change. It's relevant to any kind of study of catastrophes and catastrophic events. And it is an open problem in economics. All right, quick conclusions. A lot we don't know. And we shouldn't make believe we know more than we do. It's just, I stress the uncertainty because if you don't know something, don't make believe you do know something. If we don't know the impact of climate change, don't make believe that we do. What matters is the possibility of a catastrophic outcome. And we have to think about that. We're not going to use models. The models won't tell us anything right now. And given the uncertainty, there's a lot of uncertainty. Should we wait? No, we have to focus on the value of insurance and figure out what is that value of insurance, because we think it's large. And we also have to think about other potential catastrophes. And if you have nothing, and then you are looking for problems to work on, population growth, bad, good, how do we think about it? All right, I'll stop here. For those of you who have nothing to do at night, you need something to read, here are some things to read. I'll stop.
Okay, thank you very much for your interesting analysis regarding climate change. We have two actually questions from two members of AAERE with recorded videos in advance. One, the first one is Professor Budi Rezo Sudamo from Australian National University, and second person is the Professor Chico Umechu from Kyoto University. Why don't you show both videos together, and then after listening to those two questions, and then you can answer to those questions. Okay. Why don't you show?
Okay. There's no sound.
First of all, I would like to thank Professor Pindyck for a very inspiring presentation, encouraging us to think more about the issue on climate change and its impact. From your presentation, I have two questions. The first one is related to your suggestion or encouragement to take into account adaptation that has been taken related to climate change. I think that is a good idea. However, it seems to me that a lot of many activities that are not directly toward adaptation has been happening. And the question is that how we exactly count the value of the activity toward adaptation. Yeah. For example, adaptation, change of many fishery activities surrounding mangrove area, mainly due to the belief that they could better fish in the area, so they could harvest more, rather than toward an adaptation of climate change. However, that activities is actually can be seen as adaptation of climate change. So that things is not clear how we should count that as an adaptation. Furthermore, I would argue that general development activities could be seen as adaptation. So how we exactly distinguish that this is an adaptation toward climate change, or this is just an activity to improve human well-being? The second question is related to your suggestion that we need to be ready with the uncertain, and so then we ready to it future catastrophe. And you suggest that insurance value of life need to be developed faster. I just wonder whether that suggestion is also appropriate for developing country, given saving rate in many developing countries has been relatively small. And so if that is the main mechanism, we can expect that the gap between developed and developing country is actually widening because of our reaction toward climate change. Thank you. And again, thank you for your nice presentation.
Okay, why don't you show the second?
Thank you very much to Professor Pindyck for excellent and most relevant presentation. My name is Chieko Umetsu from Kyoto University. I have two questions. First, Professor Pindyck mentioned two ways to reduce future carbon dioxide emissions: to reduce GDP or to reduce carbon intensity. To what degree people's change in attitudes or behaviors towards environmental concern is likely to affect and shape future carbon dioxide emissions? Is there a need to modify the concept of growth itself? The second question is, what is the social cost of methane emissions compared to social cost of carbon? How agricultural sector can contribute to reducing methane emissions, while the demand of livestock is likely to expand due to population increase in most developing countries. I very much appreciate if you could respond to these questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Pindyck. You have actually 4 questions to answer. Please.
Yes. Okay, so look, first, examples of adaptation and general development activity. I think it doesn't matter so much what we call these things. We're looking for ways to reduce the impact of climate change. That's it. And it may be the things we do are useful to adapt to climate change, and they're also useful in general, and simply to increase development and increase GDP, and that's fine. I don't think it's important that we distinguish the two. You mentioned the developing countries, low savings rate, the gap. That's a big problem, and it's a problem because remember I said we need a global agreement to reduce emissions. Well, how do you get a global agreement? When, let's take India. India says, look, we're a poor country. And yes, our emissions are growing rapidly, but on a per capita basis, CO2 emissions per person in India are much lower than the United States or Europe or Japan or Korea. So why should we have to reduce emissions so much? And there's no simple answer to that. How do you come up with a fair allocation of burden? Let me go to the next 2 questions. Changes in attitudes and beliefs. Sure. I mean, it's always nice. Maybe people will, because of their attitudes, will try to reduce their energy use. That's a good thing. I don't think it will do a lot, but it's good. And then you asked about the social cost of methane. So, and what can the agricultural sector do? 2 things. First, I don't have an estimate for the social cost of methane. I don't know what it is. I've never seen a good estimate of the social cost of methane. Here's the problem. Methane emissions are much more powerful than CO2 in terms of warming. About 50 times, 60, 70 times as powerful. But methane emissions right now are very low relative to CO2 emissions. And methane stays in the atmosphere for about 10 years. CO2 stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. So the net result is that while methane is an issue, and while methane does affect warming, it's of limited impact. It's not as important as CO2. And look, we're not. Maybe we'll all become vegans. I don't know. But right now, we have a lot of cows and we have a lot of livestock. They are producing methane, but methane's coming from many, many sources. I think the biggest problem is CO2 right now, as opposed to methane. I'll stop.
Okay, thank you very much. I feel that your lecture gave us important messages as well as research assignments, especially to environmental economists on the various issues of climate change. Thank you very much, and I hope you always be healthy. And is there any? We have 1 or 2 minutes left, so if you if you want to some more comments or something to say, then go ahead.
Should I take more questions or?
I don't think we can take questions, but if you have something to say to Asian economists, environmental economists, just go
Sure.
ahead. 1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, the message I have for the Asian and Asian environmental and resource economists is the same as I do for European and North American environmental and resource economists. I think there's some very fundamental problems we need to look at. There are the little problems. We build models and models and models of climate, and we on and on and on. But there's some very fundamental problems about how do we think about catastrophic risk, and how do we think about the role of valuing life? when we think about what we can do to reduce catastrophic risk. How much money are we willing to spend to reduce catastrophic risk? And these are very big problems that we don't really have answers to. And these are things that I think that environmental economists should be looking at. It's something I'm working on right now. I'm interested in, for example, sustainability, sustainable consumption, and how does population interact with that? How do you think about that? But I think these are things that there's a lot of room for research and work.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Bye. Why don't we
My pleasure.
give us
Thanks.
him applause? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Yes.
Thanks for listening.